On June 19, 1865, 2,000 federal soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas. They brought with them the announcement that more than 250,000 enslaved people in Texas were now free. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years earlier, but it wasn't implemented in states like Texas that were still technically under Confederate control. So on the day that we now know as Juneteenth, freedom from slavery was celebrated, and it's still celebrated to this day. 3 years ago, President Joe Biden signed a law declaring June 19th a federal holiday.
By making Juneteenth a federal holiday, all Americans can feel the power of this day and learn from our history.
Juneteenth has often been overlooked in the United States, but many Black Americans have been celebrating the holiday since 1865. Early on, these celebrations consisted of parades and gatherings in the thousands, and today there are barbecues, the flying of the Juneteenth flag, and the serving of red food and drinks. The color red symbolizes perseverance and the blood that was shed by ancestors of the enslaved. Welcome to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we look at the tradition of Juneteenth. The holiday is often a time to learn more about Black history in America. Later in the show, we'll hear from distinguished professor Dr. William Darity. He'll explain the history of reparations and the racial wealth gap that exists today. But first, more on the celebration of Juneteenth. Aaliyah L. Agostini is a mom and children's book author. Her books include The Juneteenth Story, celebrating the end of slavery in the United States, and most recently, The Juneteenth Cookbook. Aaliyah, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much, Kalila. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Juneteenth was just recognized as a federal holiday back in 2021. And some people are just starting to know about this important occasion. But your family has been honoring this milestone and this marker for quite some time. What makes Juneteenth such a special occasion for you to say we need to honor it and understand it?
So I'm so pleased that it's finally a national holiday, and it has been now for about 3 years. But I grew up in Buffalo, New York, where we've been celebrating Juneteenth since 1976. It's no coincidence that that falls around the time of the American Bicentennial, when a group of activists from the BUILD organization, my grandfather was part of it, in Buffalo, were looking for a culturally responsive alternative to American Bicentennial celebration for the descendants of formerly enslaved people who clearly were not free for 200 years. So they started the Juneteenth celebration in Buffalo after hearing about it in other places. And it really kind of grew to become a real fixture in our community. And so I grew up celebrating Juneteenth. There are pictures of me in my stroller at Juneteenth. There's pictures of me selling snow cones with my family at Juneteenth. And there's pictures of me even with my own baby at Juneteenth. So it's really been something that's been part of our family for a long time, but also our greater Buffalo community. I've met so many people that might have come to Buffalo for one reason or another, whether for school or something else. And so many of them actually told me, since I've been on this, this book journey, that they actually learned about Juneteenth during their time in Buffalo. And so that's been really special to see how that tradition has really impacted so many people.
I think it's amazing to hear the reverence for Juneteenth happening in Buffalo, because for many people, it started as a recognition in the South, particularly in Texas, given the dynamics of what happened to make Juneteenth even possible. But to hear about how it has spread to Buffalo, how important it is to community and family, it's critical. But what I also hear from you is that this is a celebration of culture, of community, a respect for history. It is very different from the fear that I have, is that it will become this commercialized reason of just another reason for people to take a day off or not have to work. How has the celebration of Juneteenth changed from the time when you were a kid in a stroller celebrating it to what you see now in Buffalo, but also in other places?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was in Buffalo celebrating it, it was really focused more so around the festival itself. And I think that Juneteenth celebrations across the country, because Buffalo is not the only one that's long had a Juneteenth. There are other places throughout the Midwest, further west, of course, throughout the South that have been celebrating Juneteenth in different ways. So people have been celebrating it in festivals. They've also been celebrating it in smaller independent celebrations, or barbecues of their own too. So it's been really nice. I now live in the New Jersey area to see so many Black people kind of really galvanizing around the celebration to establish their own newer Juneteenth festivals and also to have their own specific celebrations. I have a barbecue that I'm going to. There's one that's a grown-ups only barbecue that'll be fun. I'm going to a few festivals and things like that too. It's been really nice to see people take it in their own iterations too. But one thing you also mentioned too was the commercialization of the holiday too. And that's something that I feel like I've seen ebb and flow too, even though the holiday itself is only 3 years old as a national holiday. At first, we saw some missteps from some companies that had their watermelon this or their red velvet that. And while those are actually rooted in a piece of the Juneteenth tradition, I think the part that was missing was the link back to Blackness, right? It's like, what are you actually doing to support the Black farmers that might make the milk that could potentially make the ice cream, right? What are you doing to elevate us on a daily basis? So that's been the part that's been missing. And I feel like in some cases there are some companies that are just stepping away from the holiday because they're not sure necessarily how to broach it. And so it's really been this interesting ride. But overall, the thing that has really brought me joy is the fact that so many celebrations have sprung up in other parts of the country where they didn't necessarily exist before.
At the core of it, Juneteenth is a recognition of freedom denied, but also a celebration of freedom, the freedom to be, to exist, to define. You bring that experience, that authenticity into your books. And so the ideas come, I imagine, because the experiences are partially your own, but also the ways that you want to provide a mirror for other young people who feel like their stories, their experiences are not represented. And you have this book about Juneteenth, the Juneteenth story. You are dealing with the topic of slavery that is very difficult in many ways. And yet you make it in a way that children can understand it without being afraid, without being turned off by it. But you also don't mince words to make clear this is important. This is an important part of our history and our experience. Let's address it instead of just ignoring it. Tell us about that process of this is a book that I want to write because I think it's a story that needs to be told.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what I do is because I want it to be a greater service, frankly, to the world. For the Juneteenth story, it was written right around the time it was becoming a national holiday. And I knew that there was this interesting opportunity to tell both children and adults at the same time about the origins of the Juneteenth holiday. Because there were so many adults that I was speaking to, even my peers, my former classmates that didn't know about Juneteenth and hadn't heard about it. And they felt so ashamed almost that they didn't know about this important part of our history. But the reality was it was included in our curriculums, right? So how would they know? This is omitted history. So one thing that I've noticed, as I talk to kids, I'm a mom, my kids have a lot of friends. And now as an author, I'm interacting with even more. But kids understand fundamental elements of justice and fairness. And sometimes I feel like as they become older, it's like unlearned, it's like all the exceptions are layered on top of them. But when they're younger, they get it. They get what's fair and what's not. And I really think that, children's literature is especially important because it has such a strong effect on young minds. And these are the books that really kind of stick with you for a while. So my publisher was fully on board with making this a book that was truthful, that was accurate, that is not going to show pictures of happy people working on a field because that's not accurate. I really focus most of what I work on intersecting both joy and truth. And this one, of course, has a lot more truth than joy in this part of the story, to be honest with you. But I just thought that it was so important to use the the words, like the fact that they couldn't play when they wanted to play, they couldn't eat what they wanted to eat. It's just, these are the things that kids, these little nuggets that kids understand, like this is not a good system. And there's so many levels of unfairness. And I wanted to be accessible to children, but I also wanted their adults to learn at the same time too. And I think it was done effectively, because as people, the same people that were ashamed to admit that they didn't know about Juneteenth told me that they would read the book to their children and that they too would learn something at the same time. So that's really the beauty of kidlit, especially picture books, because it winds up being a full family experience.
You're creating stories that are accessible and empowering, really in a multi-generational and intergenerational way. You mentioned the words joy and truth. And I want to talk about an area that to me is critical when we think about joy and truth, and that is food, right? The joy of food being this opportunity to share family traditions, to bring people together. The truth part of it is often about the accessibility that people had in terms of quality of food, the items that were available, and the ways that people created something from very little. What was the inspiration behind writing the Juneteenth cookbook?
Yeah, so the Juneteenth cookbook, which just came out, it's really, it's more so, I think, a little bit more of the joy part of the joy and truth, as you said. So the Juneteenth story, did really well as an opportunity for people to learn the history in a more traditional format. But my publisher was interested in really bringing Juneteenth celebrations to life for kids, for families, for schools. And there hadn't been a Juneteenth cookbook done for children yet. And culinary tradition is an important part of my family. My grandmother she's not deceased, but she was a retired home economics teacher, and she was the one who she would probably write about half of the recipes in the church cookbook. Like, she was just known as Frances. She was the lady who could burn. She could make anything, and she made more than soul food too. I was really excited about the possibility of making a cookbook, because I wanted it to be even more expansive than that. I wanted it to be focused on the full experience of the creativity that we bring to the table, the culture that we bring to the table from food, and also just teaching kids about the holiday in more of a hands-on way. The cookbook itself talks about some of the traditions of Juneteenth, as I mentioned before, like watermelon is a red fruit. Red foods are connected to Juneteenth. It's about bringing in information about this food and the connection that it actually has to the African diaspora. So many people think of, watermelon is used in more of a stereotypical way, but actually watermelons did come over from Africa, just like black-eyed peas did, kale, a lot of other things, okra. A lot of vegetables that we see now is more like Southern American ones. And I wanted to make sure that we were highlighting dishes that mostly are part of our cookout mainstays, things that people could, again, as you were talking about the mirrors that children have, they could open up this book and say, hey, wait a minute, my family makes that, but I want to know this different way that I can make it too. So it's just really incredible, just kind of the breadth of culinary history that we have, whether it be recipes and ingredients that kind of originated from the West African diaspora, things that we were ultimately forced to learn and kind of put our own spin on, like barbecue, which was started by indigenous people, but then as enslavers got a taste for barbecue and the enslaved had to make it for them. It's just, our culinary history is such a rich part of the Juneteenth story, and also the broader American story too. So it was just really fun to put together this cookbook to bring kids into the fold, and my kids actually have a lot of fun with the recipes themselves too, and of course the eating part, because sometimes they're only so focused, but it really is just a strong reminder of how far we've come. And also my grandmother's potato salad recipe is in there too, because I had to make sure to give a shout out to her.
As we come to a close of our conversation, I want to describe for the listeners the image that is behind you right now, Aaliyah. It is this beautiful picture, very bright, vibrant colors of, it looks like children and people together in joy and in celebration. And the words on this image say, celebrate freedom. and the middle of the word is read, R-E-A-D. And so my question to you, as an author, as a mom, as someone who's creating legacy and access for others, what does freedom mean to you in this moment?
Oh, goodness. So freedom, as we have it spelled here, is really focused on making sure that everybody has the freedom to read the books that they need that speak to their souls without any kind of limitations. As an author, coming in at this time has been a really, frankly, interesting one where we fortunately had the little bit of the tide that we were riding from people's interest in diverse books, in 2020 and 2021 to this direct pushback that we're getting now as people attempt to ban books that simply tell stories of Black joy or of joy of people of different sexual orientations or anything like that, or that tell the truth about history in a way that's not necessarily sanitized. And I just want to make sure that we all have access to share the truth with our children. And it's really upsetting, when I think about it right now. But we've fought for so long, even for the right to read. So we should truly have the ability to be able to read whatever people that look like us who are now producing books in mass, are sharing about our culture. So yeah, I want everybody to push back as much as you possibly can in your own respective communities against book bans, because we're only really hurting ourselves.
Aaliyah L. Agostini is a mom, marketer, and children's book author. Her books, The Juneteenth Story, Celebrating the End of Slavery in the United States, and The Juneteenth Cookbook are now available. Thank you, Aaliyah.
Thank you so much.
You can learn more about Aaliyah's books by visiting our website. It's ctpublic.org/disrupted. Coming up, we'll hear from an economist about reparations and the racial wealth gap.
It's that unmet promise that lays the foundation for the debt that is still owed to the descendants of that community.
You're listening to Disrupted. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring the history and tradition of Juneteenth. The same year as the first Juneteenth recognition, newly freed Black leaders presented a proposal for reparations. They sent that proposal to General William T. Sherman, and it led to Special Field Order Number 15, also known as the 40 Acres and a Mule Order. The proposal allocated land along the Atlantic coast to formerly enslaved people. The idea was to provide economic independence from the injustices of slavery. But President Andrew Johnson reversed the order and returned the land back to its original owners. Since then, there's been a great deal of debate over reparations for Black Americans in the U.S. There have been a number of proposals at the local level, but it hasn't yet gained traction at the federal level. Dr. William Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. His most recent award-winning book is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Professor, welcome to Disrupted.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You are a leading voice on the subject of reparations. It is an area that many people have an immediate visceral response to, and those responses often lack context and nuance and really historical accuracy. So I want to start at the very basic question, and that is, when we speak of reparations, what are we actually talking about, and what are the origins of that concept?
So in the work that Kirsten Mullen and I have done in our book, From Here to Equality, we define reparations as follows: a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Acknowledgement means that the community that bears responsibility for the grievous injustice, admits that it has done so, and then makes a commitment to engage in an act of restitution. Redress is that act of restitution, which historically, when we talk about communities that have been subjected to atrocities, frequently means the payment of monetary compensation to that community by the culpable party. And then the third component of reparations, as we define it, is closure, which means that the culpable party and the victimized community come to an agreement that the debt has been paid or the account is settled. And the victimized community won't make any further claims for compensation on the culpable party unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or new atrocities take place. So essentially, as I said, this is a program, a compensatory program of restorative justice.
It's a compensatory program that has layers and stages. And what I appreciate about the way you and your co-author lay it out is that there is a mutual conversation happening. It's not just one group saying, this is what we will give you, and you just accept what we've put forth. That acknowledgement is so key. Professor, how do we get to that very basic component of acknowledgement in a country that is battling over whether to teach history in its fullness? What are the dynamics of getting to that first step of acknowledgement?
I think it's actually the prospect of getting to that first step that has led to this assault on the way in which history is being taught in the United States. If you go back to the year 2000, the beginning of this millennium, a research survey that was conducted by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popov, two scholars at the University of Chicago, found that only 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations to Black Americans. Probably closer to 60 to 65% of Black Americans themselves at the time, but only 4% of white Americans. A survey that was conducted by a research team at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst at the beginning of 2023 found that the percentage had risen for white Americans to closer to 30% and was approaching 90% for Black Americans. And I think it's in this climate of a change in the recognition of the atrocities that have been conducted against the Native Black American population, that climate of change in recognition of the atrocities and also increased willingness to try to do something about it, that the more recalcitrant segments of the American population, and I would say it's about 30 to 35% of white Americans, have become more resistant and have engaged in more severe acts of backlash. And that includes this attack on so-called critical race theory, which purports to be the way in which history has been taught. I think that the change in American attitudes was a consequence of being exposed to a more accurate record of the American past. And so there are folks who are working to reverse that process because they're dissatisfied with the way in which attitudes have been changing in this country.
I want to lift up a piece of what you just said to put a bracket around. You used the phrase Native Black American population. And there's a big discussion about who we are actually talking about when we talk about claims for reparations in the United States, who should be included, what those boundaries are. Talk to us about the intentional use of that phrase, Native Black American population.
Well, sometimes I put that phrase in air quotes, but the idea is that the community that merits reparations from the United States government that has never received payment from the United States government is Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. And the reason is because this is the population that has descended from the individuals who were emancipated during the course of the Civil War and at the end of the Civil War, who were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage. and this was a promise that was not kept. It's that unmet promise that lays the foundation for the debt that is still owed to the descendants of that community to the present day. It is the failure to provide those 40 acres at the same time that the federal government provided 1.5 million white families with 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories. It's those two policies, a policy of denial and a policy of provision, that laid the foundation for the racial wealth gap that we observe now. And that gap in wealth is staggering. The average Black household has $1.15 million less in net worth than the average white household. And that would come to approximately $400,000 per Black American descendant of persons enslaved in the United States.
I want to come back to the contemporary manifestations of what you have just cited is the early refusal and failure to make good on the promises that were made to Black Americans. But Professor, some people will point out this has been done in the United States for other groups. So they'll talk about the Indian Claims Commission, which, although it created a payment or the idea of payment to Native Americans, it was still held in a trust that the people intended to benefit could not control. We've seen this with victims of internment here in the United States. So some people will say, we've done this before. What is it about honoring the debt or the promise to Black Americans that gives so many people pause? Why is this different given that history that you've just laid out?
Well, the Japanese victims of mass incarceration or internment actually did receive direct payments from the U.S. government. Those funds were not put into a trust at all. And there's a host of other examples of cases where the United States government has provided compensatory payments to groups and individuals who have been harmed. There's a terrific essay in a new issue of the Russell Sage Foundation's Social Science Journal by Linda Bilmes and by Cornell William Brooks, in which they document a host of instances in which the United States government has made reparatory payments. So that does leave open your question as a really, really important one. So if all these other groups or individuals have received some form of compensatory payment, why haven't Black Americans? And I guess when I come down to it, I end up at a very, very simple explanation. It's good old-fashioned American racism that constitutes the obstacle to meeting this debt that is owed to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And that's why it's so important that we pay close attention to how people's attitudes and beliefs are changing, and hopefully changing in a direction that will make it possible for Congress to pass the legislation that's required to address this longstanding injustice.
So for our listeners, my first opportunity to meet Professor Darity in person was at a conference that you hosted in Washington, D.C. about the three key amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. And Professor, a part of that conference was going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I was struck walking in to that sacred space is what it feels like. That quote on the wall, we have an obligation to tell the unvarnished truth. And so much of this work that you are doing about reparations is telling that unvarnished truth, or folks from where I grew up would say to call a thing a thing. Even in the face of this overwhelming sense to do these things, you see Black Americans and communities trying to exert their sense of agency to create space and create opportunity to address some of these wrongs. You have talked about things like Cali House, that even when groups tried to organize, government and others stepped in to shut it down. Talk to us a little bit about how government worked to suppress those efforts of agency and self-determination for Black Americans.
Well, if we're thinking about expressions of agency and self-determination that are specific to the case and movement for reparations. Yes, at every turn, something has happened to block that from taking place. If you think about the commitment to 40-acre land grants, the first significant phase of that was embodied in General William T. Sherman's Special Field Orders Number 15, which made provision for the allocation of 5.3 million acres of land along the Atlantic coast, stretching from the Sea Islands of South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Florida, as a site that was to be set aside for the formerly enslaved. By the end of 1865, President Andrew Johnson had reversed that policy and discontinued it. So that's the first instance in which the reparations effort gets shunted off. You mentioned Callie House, who was a woman who made her living by cleaning laundry in Tennessee. She had been enslaved formerly, and in the latter part of the 19th century, she became the leader of a movement that consisted of upwards of 300,000 formerly enslaved individuals who were seeking pensions from the United States government in lieu of any kind of retirement support or compensation that they'd received during their years of slavery. And the federal government then moved to bring mail fraud charges, to manufacture mail fraud charges against Callie House, for which she was convicted and imprisoned for, I think, at least 2 years. So in the process, they removed her capability for leading that movement. Many of her followers then transferred themselves into the Garvey movement at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Garvey movement had an element of engagement with the reparations issue. But, Garvey himself was then subjected to similar mail fraud charges to the type that were brought against Callie House, and he was dismissed from his capacity to lead his movement. In the mid-20th century, the followers of Garvey then gravitate around a charismatic woman named Queen Mother Audley Moore, who became the voice of the reparations effort at that point. And her efforts resulted in a document being submitted to the United Nations calling for reparatory action. But even though many years later, the United Nations had a commission that recommended reparations in the United States, at the point at which she brought forth her petition, there was no significant action taken. We don't have much attention being drawn in a very public way to the issue of reparations until the beginning of the 2000s, when a man named David Horowitz circulated an advertisement that was placed in college newspapers around the country attacking reparations. I think, what is reparations and 10 reasons why it's a bad idea, I think, or something like that was what was in the advertisement. And interestingly enough, it actually stimulated a significant amount of attention to the reparations question, to the point at which individuals like Jesse Jackson were going to make an effort to push a new push for reparations. But that was undermined, interestingly enough, by the occurrence of 9/11, which drew people's attention entirely away from the question of reparations to a focus on issues of global terrorism. Since 2019, I think reparations has stayed pretty much in the national conversation. It has a kind of credibility in the national conversation that I don't think it has had since the Reconstruction era. Can we sustain the conversation? Can we make this happen? I'm not sure, but I'm going to do my personal best to try it.
Coming up, Professor William Darity explains the racial wealth gap.
The racial wealth gap is one of the most useful indicators of the cumulative economic consequences of white supremacy.
Disrupted will be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at the history of Juneteenth. We've been looking at the debate around reparations with Dr. William Darity. He's the Samuel Du Bois Cook Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. His most recent book is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Almost 2/3 of Americans oppose the idea of reparations. That's according to a poll from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Some people don't believe that they should have to pay for the atrocities of their ancestors. But Professor Darity says the descendants of enslavers have benefited from slavery. Ask Professor Darity to explain the relationship between reparations and the racial wealth gap that exists today.
It's the sins of the father that translates into advantage for a segment of the population in the present moment and disadvantage for another segment of the population in the present moment. Kirsten Mullen and I argue that the racial wealth gap is one of the most useful indicators of the cumulative economic consequences of white supremacy across generations. And we've argued also that difference in wealth between the average Black and white household is a consequence of policies that have been pursued by our nation's government. I mentioned earlier the land policies that were instituted in the late 19th century, the reversal and elimination of the effort to provide the formerly enslaved with an asset in land, the 40 acres, while I guess approximately 10% of the white American population received 160-acre land grants in the Western territories. From my perspective, that's the foundation for the existing racial wealth gap. In the 20th century, the federal government moves away from asset building practices based upon land distribution to asset building practices that were based upon encouraging people to buy homes. And the federal government provided a number of supports for home buying, including changing the entire structure of how mortgage payments were made. And so the problem here is that, once again, this was done in a racially uneven or inequitable fashion. It was performed or conducted in a highly discriminatory way. So that with the introduction of the first phase of federal subsidies for home buying, you also had redlining, which excluded large numbers of Black Americans from access to the same types of credit markets that would have permitted them to buy homes. And then you had the adoption of the GI Bill to support returning veterans from World War II. And the home buying provisions of the GI Bill were highly discriminatorily applied. So the major asset building initiative in the 20th century is one that built white wealth, but did not build Black wealth. And to the extent that people's financial resources are transferred from one generation to the next, we've built up a situation in which white households on average can substantially provide resources for children and grandchildren in a way that Black families can't. And this is how we consolidate and maintain the racial wealth difference. And so a reparations plan is a significant way in which we could intervene and alter those conditions so that we could have greater fairness in the initial financial conditions that young people and their families encounter.
So, in light of what we've just discussed in terms of the historical roots of many of these gaps and differences and the contemporary manifestations, you have states like New York, California, Connecticut, who are offering to create these reparations commissions. Right now, the town of Evanston, Illinois, has been sued by a conservative group called Judicial Watch, arguing that it is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause for Evanston to have a reparations plan for its residents and descendants who were victimized not by enslavement, but by the red zoning and the redlining and housing discrimination that you just mentioned. Professor, is this effective to do these things at the local level or the state level? Or should this be a federal affirmation and response to what is really a long-standing pattern in the U.S.?
So I feel strongly that it has to be a policy that's conducted at the federal level, and that the state and local initiatives, to whatever extent what people are proposing are positives, should not be called reparations. If they want to call it something else, like racial equity initiatives, please do, but I think it's pretentious and presumptuous to use the label reparations for those types of initiatives. In particular, those initiatives are necessarily going to be incomplete, inconsistent, and inequitable. They're going to be incomplete because the minimal requirement for elimination of the racial wealth gap in the United States is an expenditure of $16 trillion. States and localities, all of the states and localities across the United States have a combined budget of less than $5 trillion. They don't have the capacity to meet the bill. They are not capable of meeting the bill under those circumstances, not without unfathomably large increases in their taxes. And states and localities are constrained by their tax base in a way in which the federal government is not. Indeed, the federal government has demonstrated its capacity to generate and distribute huge sums of money very quickly in response to the Great Recession and also in response to the pandemic. So from the standpoint of completeness or comprehensiveness, this has to be a federal project. States and localities simply can't do it. That'd be incomplete. States and localities' actions will be inconsistent also because they are uncoordinated and they are not established within the fabric of some kind of centralized approach to doing this. And then as a consequence of that, they will be inequitable because there will be differences across communities as to whom is identified as the eligible population, and different communities are doing different things. Keep in mind that really there's about 50 towns and cities that have initiated some process that they link to reparations. But there's in excess of 100,000 towns and cities in the United States. So there are going to be some communities where nothing is done at all, never mind variations in what is done across the communities that pursue something along this line.
Both the beauty and the challenge of federalism is that you can have localized solutions, but it makes it vulnerable in many different ways. And one area that we've seen states attempt to do this is through the process of baby bonds. You and your former student, Derek Hamilton, have been called the architects of baby bonds. Tell us how baby bonds help not eradicate the racial wealth gap, but create a stronger sense of financial stability and outlook to the young people, the children, or their families who may be eligible.
Yeah, well, I do want to make it clear that baby bonds and reparations are not the same thing for me, nor are baby bonds a substitute for reparations. So I would love to see a world in which we had baby bonds and reparations. But baby bonds is a somewhat different idea. It's the premise that every newborn infant ought to have a trust account. Kids who are from families that are exceptionally wealthy frequently are given trust accounts, which they can access when they reach young adulthood. Why don't we do that for all children? And why don't we do it in such a way that we calibrate the amounts based upon the wealth position of their parents? And so that's the basic idea, that we would have essentially a universal guaranteed wealth position for all children in the United States. It would be universal, but as I said, it would not be uniform. We would adjust the amounts based upon the wealth position of the child's family. And so in the initial versions of the plan that we put forward, the idea was if somebody like Bill Gates or Oprah Winfrey had a child, we would give them a symbolic baby bond, if you will, or trust account of say $50 or $100. But for children who are born into families at the lowest end of the wealth distribution, then we would give them something in the vicinity of $50,000 to $60,000. And there have been some efforts at the state level to begin experimenting with this, and Connecticut is one of the states. I would like to say that doing things that make people better off financially are not necessarily the same things that would eliminate the racial wealth gap, and vice versa. All ways in which we might try to eliminate the racial wealth gap would not necessarily make everybody better off financially. We could have a very perverse way of eliminating the racial wealth gap, and that is we could tax white wealth away until white average levels of wealth were the same as current Black levels of wealth. So just drive white levels of wealth down to Black levels, and then we would have equal levels of wealth between Blacks and whites. But I don't think anybody would be better off under those circumstances. So we need to find the sweet spot where we could close the racial wealth gap and improve well-being simultaneously. And if we had a combination of baby bonds and a reparations plan, that would be right at the sweet spot.
So much to think about, and it's one of the many reasons I appreciate your voice, Professor, because you always challenge us, and you always challenge us beyond complacency and sort of basic knowledge. Dr. William Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. His most recent book is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Wayne Edwards, Meg Dalton, Robin Doyon Aiken, and Katie Tolarski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.